few more, but we'll go here. Good evening and good morning to those of you who might be joining us this evening's webinar from Asia and the Pacific. My name is Joseph Gerson, and I'm happy to be welcoming speakers and all of you on behalf of the Committee for Sane U.S. China Policy, the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, one of our co-sponsors, and Massachusetts Peace Action, another of our co-sponsors. I'm going to keep my introductory remarks to a minimum to maximize the time that we have with our three deeply knowledgeable and experienced panelists. Yun Sun of the Stimson Institute, Xi Jinping of Bucknell University, and my friend and colleague Michael Klare, the co-chair of the Committee for Sane U.S. China Policy. The November 15th San Francisco summit between Presidents Biden and Xi is now history. While we can all breathe a little easier as a result of their joint pledges to reduce tensions and to improve cooperation on climate change and other issues, the structural forces that drive U.S.-Chinese competition in the military, economic, diplomatic realms persist. Maneuvering for Asia-Pacific hegemony continues apace. Today, Xi Jinping is in Vietnam, following President Biden's visit there in September, in order to improve security cooperation as the two powers jockey for regional advantage. In recent days, 15 PLA aircraft entered Taiwan's air defense identification zone or crossed the median line in the Taiwan Strait, which separates China from Taiwan. 2 days earlier, the Chinese military said it scrambled jet fighters to warn away U.S. Poseidon maritime reconnaissance aircraft as it conducted surveillance flights over the Taiwan Strait. And on December 4th, the Chinese military said it had mobilized in order to chase away two U.S. littoral combat ships, which had illegally intruded into Chinese claimed waters near the second Thomas Shoal in the South China Sea. That's an area claimed by both China and the Philippines. And late last month, the U.S. Navy guided missile destroyer Hopper conducted a freedom of navigation mission near the Parcel Islands in the South China Sea, a cluster of atolls and islets claimed by China, Taiwan, and Vietnam. So the contest for power and influence is not limited, and it's not limited to the Asia-Pacific region either. As we can read in the lead article in the most recent issue of Foreign Affairs, the outcome of the horrendous Israel-Gaza war and related diplomacy may have defining impacts on the struggle between the two great powers for access and influence across the Middle East, including the increasingly wealthy and influential Gulf states. This evening, our three speakers will bring us up to date about the Xi-Biden agreements and the markers that they laid down at the Filoli estate on the margins of the APEC summit. Also about the actual state of U.S. Chinese relations and competition, and how policies and actions should be adjusted to help ensure that the planet has room for both China and the United States, as well as for the rest of the world's people. Again, Yun Sun is Senior Fellow and Co-Director of the East Asia Program and Director of the China Program at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. Xi Jinping is Professor of Political Science and International Relations at Bucknell University, and Michael Klare is Professor Emeritus of Peace and World Security Studies at Hampshire College, and he's the defense correspondent for The Nation magazine. They are our expert panelists for this evening. We'll begin with 2 rounds of questions. We'll give each of our speakers an opportunity to push back or question what one another have said, and then we'll move to our question and answer period. I expect that all of you are veterans of this process, but just to remind you that if you have a question you'd like to pose, please use the Q&A button at the bottom and center of your computer screen to post it. The chat function is inoperative this evening, and we ask you to limit your Q&A posts to questions so that I don't have to struggle to find them amidst the clutter of comments. So let me then turn to Yun Sun to ask you in 5 minutes to give us an abbreviated understanding of what transpired at the Xi-Biden summit and their implications. The floor is yours, Yun.
Thank you so much, Joseph. It's truly an honor to be on this panel. To cut to the chase, just go to what happened in San Francisco and what are the takeaway. I think from the from the statements that we could see from the summit, we know that there are three concrete or tangible deliverables that the Chinese agreed to. The first one is cooperation on fentanyl issue, which is truly important for the U.S. domestic politics. And the second issue is the resumption of the meal-to-meal. This is also something that the Biden administration has been focused on and really emphasizing and pursuing with the Chinese government since quite a while ago, actually this year, since the very beginning. So it's calling for U.S. and China to have some crisis management mechanism, and the emphasis of the importance to have the communications channel open between the two militaries in the event of a potential accident, say in the Taiwan Strait or in the South China Sea, is of utmost importance for I would say for the both sides of the Pacific. But we also know that the Chinese side suspended the meal-to-meal dialogue mechanisms after the the former Speaker of the House Pelosi's visit to Taiwan last year. So these channels have not been open. And one good example is that in February, when the balloon incident happened, U.S. side tried to reach out to the Chinese Ministry of National Defense, and the hotline simply was not answered. And the communications was very much blocked from that perspective. So the resumption or the agreement to resume the meal-to-meal dialogue that came out of San Francisco summit is really important. Well, we still have to see that how soon and how smooth that this resumption will actually transpire, because to my knowledge, it has been, well, actually it has been a month since these agreements were reached, but so far there doesn't seem to be a lot of movement on this particular issue. Well, at the same time, it's also true that China currently does not have a defense minister. So but it does not prevent China from engaging the United States on other levels in terms of the meal-to-meal dialogue. So that's the second deliverable. And the third deliverable, people don't usually see it as a deliverable, but I actually think it's quite important, which is Xi Jinping's statement and his commitment that China does not have a plan to attack Taiwan before 2027. We can imagine that the goal of this statement is to disperse the U.S. Heated discussion about China's pending invasion of Taiwan by 2027. So I think the coming from Xi, such a open statement or commitment will have to carry the credibility. Well, 2027 is not that far away, but at least it is something to begin with. Looking from the San Francisco summit, a lot of the importance, I would say, is more symbolic for the Chinese rather than substantive, because if you look at the statements from either side, the concrete deliverable for the Chinese side is almost non-existent. There is going to be a working level AI conversation, the dialogue on artificial intelligence, but that is just a dialogue, right? That's on the working level. So if you look at the tangible takeaway for the Chinese, it's really pretty thin. But I think at this point, the Chinese side is looking more for the stabilization of the bilateral relations. In order for next year, China could prioritize its domestic issues. And from the economic performance of China this year, we do know that China has a lot of domestic issues, and it is understandable that Beijing will want to prioritize and focus on the domestic obstacles or domestic challenges. So in that sense, I think to have a relatively stable relationship with the United States is not a prerequisite for China to focus on domestic issues, but at least it is a desirable externality to the Chinese prioritization. I think from the U.S. side, we know that next January, there's going to be the election in Taiwan, and there's a strong intention from both sides to manage the potential outcome of that election and make sure that the tension across the Taiwan Strait does not escalate too significantly. So I think for the two leaders to meet and to have some face time on the issue of Taiwan is also important for the stabilization of the bilateral relations ahead of the Taiwan election. And people do expect tension to escalate after the election, if indeed according to the current public opinion poll, the DPP candidate stands to win in that election. So
let me thank you for going as far as you have. we'll come back to you, but we want to kind of hold some time for others to speak and it saves out good time for the Q&A session later on. So Ji-kun, the same question to you, your take on the outcome of the summit and its implications.
Okay, thank you for organizing this panel and for having me. What exactly transpired during the Xi-Biden summit? I think, it's almost like one summit, two interpretations. I think both sides, very interestingly, accentuated the positives. And as you mentioned, they also agreed on several deliverables. I think, if you look at the announcements from both sides right after the meeting, it's very interesting, they're not always the same as usual. Of course, the two leaders had a long meeting, right, over 4 hours and a working lunch. They covered a wide range of issues. And both sides said they had a candid and constructive dialogue. If you look at the White House readout, you notice that I think they focused on 4 areas that the two sides agreed upon. Yun also mentioned this, right? Fentanyl, military dialogue, AI governance, and people-to-people exchanges, actually. However, on other issues, many other issues, such as trade, high-tech war, the South China Sea, and Taiwan, they apparently failed to reach any consensus. On the Taiwan issue, for example, Biden only said, according to the White House readout, he would continue to follow the long-standing One China policy and oppose unilateral change to the status quo from either side. The Chinese readout, as reported by Xinhua news agency, is a little bit different. According to Xinhua, Biden actually reiterated his 5-point promise made to Xi Jinping a year ago during their last meeting in Bali, Indonesia. Those 5 points are: the United States does not seek a new Cold War, does not seek to change China's system, does not seek to strengthen alliances to counter China, and the United States does not support Taiwan independence. Also, the United States has no intention to have confrontation with China. Now, these 5 points were not mentioned in the White House readout, but the White House, of course, did not deny either, when the Chinese side reported this. Now, according to Xinhua, Biden also said the U.S. China economies are interdependent. The United States is pleased to see China develop and become prosperous. The United States will not block China's development, nor will it decouple from China. He said the United States welcomes dialogues at various levels and would like to increase direct flights and expand educational and scientific exchanges. Now, all these were not mentioned explicitly in the White House readout. Now, as expected, the Chinese side paid more attention to Taiwan. According to Xinhua, Xi Jinping actually told Biden the United States should turn its promise of following One China into concrete actions. The United States should stop arming Taiwan and support China's peaceful reunification. Obviously, Biden is unlikely to do so. I think on other issues, China cares deeply about, such as tariffs, chips, and investment restrictions. Biden did not offer anything positive to Beijing either. I should mention that going into the summit, both sides set the bars very low. So the fact that the meeting actually took place is a positive sign, showing that the two sides are serious about managing the relationship to avoid conflict. For Biden, reaching agreements with China on fentanyl and military communication really helped him domestically when his polls are so low. And for Xi Jinping, of course, projecting himself as a global and respected leader who can manage the difficult U.S.-China relationship is crucial. So I think both leaders achieved their desired goals. Now, most significantly, both countries agree to manage the relationship responsibly, which means that despite many differences, some of which are perhaps irreconcilable, the two sides will seek cooperation in areas where they share interests. And the two leaders, of course, yeah, I'm finishing one sentence. Okay. So the two leaders actually mapped out the so-called San Francisco vision, but I think its implementation faces many challenges. So I think we want to be realistic about the relationship. We should not exaggerate the progress made at the summit, nor should we dismiss the significance of the summit either. I stop here. Thank you very much.
Xi-kun, thank you. I mean, given the stakes that are involved, the fact that they're talking and moving forward in some ways is existentially encouraging. Michael, do you want to conclude with your 5 cents here?
Yes, and thank you for keeping a close look at the clock here. That I'll try to respect that. So my view is, looking back, I spent the day looking back at the months leading up to this summit. And I think what's most important about the summit meeting is not what was accomplished, but what was avoided. And I think what was avoided was catastrophe, or a slide into catastrophe. Leading into the summit, you could see what the New York Times called a downward spiral of relations. And there was no bottom to that spiral leading into the summit meeting in San Francisco. In the months leading up, you had, beginning in February, the balloon incident, which caused a tremendous outcry in the United States, and calls from Republicans and many Democrats for a sharp increase in military spending and military preparedness vis-a-vis China, and increased arms aid to Taiwan and other steps. And you also had the Biden administration's efforts to deny China access to advanced technology, especially computer chips. And you had a series of clashes in the South China Sea and in the area around Taiwan. Joseph, you alluded to that earlier. And these seem to be occurring, these clashes seem to be occurring at an ever-increasing frequency. So coming into the summit, I think relations were headed in, as I say, in a downward spiral. And I think for the Biden administration in particular, there was an understanding that something had to be done to arrest that slide. This is evident in the diplomacy that the administration undertook in the summer and fall, sending top U.S. leaders to Beijing after a long absence. You had Secretary of State Blinken, the Commerce Secretary, the Treasury Secretary, and the climate envoy, John Kerry, all being sent one after the other to Beijing. And the purpose really was just to get talks underway and make it possible for Biden and Xi even to meet. Remember, 2 weeks before the summit, Xi hadn't even actually officially indicated that he was going to come to meet with Biden because of the uncertainty, the aura of animosity that had been the case in Washington up until then. So it took a lot of effort just to get the two sides to meet. And there was a large overhang of distrust and hostility between the two sides. I think the Chinese side felt that they were under enormous pressure from the U.S., especially over computer chips and over Taiwan. And on the U.S. side, a determination to curb China's further technological growth and challenge to the West. So an intense aura of competition and potential conflict. So in my mind, the principal accomplishment of the summit was a tempering of these hostilities and a determination on both sides to set things on a more even keel. So whatever the specific agreements they may have come to are really less important than the fact that they met, they talked, they apparently had a congenial conversation and agreed to continue talking in this mode. And as Yunsun mentioned, and Xi to resume military-to-military talks, which are very important to avert a crisis. Up for the past year, there's been no such communications, and there's been numerous incidents between U.S. and Chinese ships and planes in the South China Sea and in the area around Taiwan, where they came in very close proximity to each other, claims that Chinese planes were harassing American planes and so on, that could have triggered a crisis without any means of communication. So these—
Michael, we've got to kind of move to wrap on it.
Very good. Well, my main point has been made that I think that the main accomplishment was to step back from the brink of further disaster and open the possibility for further talks that might lead to something concrete.
Thank you. So in a sense, we've set the ground here in terms of the somewhat stabilizing of relations and, if you will, framing the landscape for the ongoing competition. I'd like now to turn again to Yunsun and get your reading on the real state beyond this of U.S. Chinese relations and what that means for priorities of U.S. policy in particular.
Well, we all know that in 2024, we also will have the presidential election here in the United States. So I suppose that it will have huge implication for U.S. foreign policy and especially for U.S. China policy. U.S. is still currently engaged in the war in Ukraine, and it's also being distracted by the Gaza crisis in the Middle East. So how to manage these competing priorities, especially in an election year, I think is going to be a key question for the administration to answer. I think most of the China observers do not expect the two governments or the two leaders to have the senior level or the top level engagement in 2024. But the good news is that through the San Francisco summit and also the groundwork that was paved before the San Francisco summit, we know that the working level communications and working level mechanisms are resuming. And hopefully next year is going to generate some positive development in terms of for example, the trade and also the longstanding issues of for example, the Chinese protectionism in terms of their the market access. So the bigger challenge, I'm afraid, is that looking at the current public opinion polls here in the United States, we are seeing that former President Trump is being very popular. In fact, I think among the 6 swing states, his popularity is much higher than the current President Biden in terms of the potentiality. So I think for the Chinese policy community, the question now is turning toward, well, we know that Biden and Xi put a floor to this relationship through their summits last year in Bali and this year in San Francisco, but this is very temporary. And this is also, if I may use a word, ephemeral. Depending on the result of next year's election, all this could be gone very quickly. Because as people in this room, in this meeting, I'll recall the dynamics between the Trump administration and China, especially since 2019, and particularly since 2020, after the outbreak of the COVID pandemic. People use the word free fall to describe U.S.-China relations during that whole year, which is actually quite accurate. So to look ahead, I'm not terribly worried for the next 11 months, basically, or the next year, where the relationship will still be under the supervision of the Biden administration. But I think potentially the risk or the challenge will come after the election, if the result of the election turns to be that it will be another victory by President Trump. Then, of course, there's still a lot of factors that are not fully transpired in that angle, in that perspective. But I think for policy analysts looking into the future, that is a very big scenario that people will have to take into consideration. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Not that I look forward to such a crisis in 2025, but thank you. Zhikun.
I think a big problem is that the United States and China have different views on the very nature of the relationship and how to manage it, of course. We all know the Biden administration has adopted this three-part China policy: invest, align, and compete. I don't think this policy will change anytime soon. Rhetorically, of course, Biden officials recently used de-risk instead of decouple from China. But I think the objective of U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy remains the same. That is to outcompete, quote unquote, outcompete China. Also, the Biden administration continues to see the world in terms of democracy versus autocracy. Now, this ideological conflict will also continue to hamper the relationship. China, on the other hand, views the relationship very differently. It advocates a win-win outcome through cooperation. China defines the relationship in terms of cooperation and peaceful coexistence. As Xi Jinping asked during his speech to over 300 business executives and other folks after his meeting with Biden in San Francisco, I quote, "The number one question for us is, are we adversaries or partners?" He said, China is ready to be a partner and friend of the United States. So I think one of the priorities for both sides should be to reach some consensus about the nature of the relationship before they develop some realistic policies and expectations. I think they have to realize that these are two very powerful but very different countries. Many of their interests are not compatible, yet there are also areas where they have to cooperate because they share common interests. So realistically, you cannot only focus either on competition or cooperation. I think both competition and cooperation are integral to this relationship. Perhaps the best we can hope for is that the two powers will try to manage the relationship peacefully and responsibly and seek cooperation when possible, despite many differences. Now, I think after the summit, the relationship is likely to stabilize for a while until the next crisis. And of course, next crisis may come in about a month after the Taiwan's election. And if the winner pursues a more radical policy, then there will be big trouble, not just across the Taiwan Strait, but between China and the United States. Down the road, of course, if Trump returns to the White House after the November election, there will be more bumpy roads ahead. I think the next U.S. president, Biden, Trump, or someone else, will have to face a divided government and a strongly anti-China Congress, which make their China policy difficult to implement. On the China side, of course, economy is slowing down. Unemployment rate is very high among young people, and foreign investment is shrinking. So that's why China welcomes U.S. cooperation to jumpstart its economy, and why China is more willing to cooperate now. Now, a couple of weeks before Xi's trip to San Francisco, even the tone of the state-controlled Chinese media suddenly became more friendly towards the United States. And in San Francisco, Xi Jinping himself launched some charm offensive by conducting giant panda diplomacy instead of wolf warrior diplomacy, which gives Americans some hope that those cute pandas may return to the National Zoo and other zoos across the country soon, hopefully. Mm-hmm. So the question is, how long such a friendly atmosphere will last? Now, globally, it was also mentioned that we have these two wars going on, Ukraine and Gaza. And the United States and China have very different views on these two wars, which obviously also poses a serious challenge to the relationship. So looking ahead, I don't think it's going to be a walk in the park for the two countries to manage this relationship. And not everything is going to be hunky-dory. I stop here.
Okay, thank you very much. Challenges ahead. Michael, do you want to come in here and, among other things, also talk about climate cooperation?
Oh, well, that's not what I was going to start with, but first of all, I agree with what Young-sun and Chikun have said about the challenges lying ahead. Certainly, if there's a Trump presidency. But let me make one point and spin that out a little bit, and that is, in the past year or so, President Biden has managed U.S. China relations more or less in isolation from the rest of the world or from other concerns. He's had a pretty clear idea in his head, an agenda of isolating China and surrounding it with a hostile bloc of pro-U.S. allies, highly armed by the U.S., highly tied to the U.S. through the AUKUS arrangement, U.S.-South Korea / Japan ties, the Quad arrangement, and other such arrangements. He's given a lot of attention to building up those relationships and otherwise trying to isolate China in world affairs with a considerable amount of success, which is why the Xi administration has been so angry at Washington and so eager to see a change, as Chikun noted earlier. But I think he was able to do that because the rest of the world wasn't impinging quite as strongly on the U.S. as is likely to be the case in the future, I think. I think the Israel-Hamas conflict is going to occupy a lot of Washington's attention for the foreseeable future. And I think that conflict is going to have impacts far beyond the Middle East, but certainly throughout the Middle East, but far beyond it. And to what those implications aren't exactly clear, but it is likely to include a fracturing of the Abraham Accords that were begun under the previous Trump administration and continued under the Biden administration, and a growing disillusionment with the United States as a leader of the so-called rules-based international order. I think it's going to be more difficult for the U.S. to build support for Ukraine. That's going to take more attention in the months ahead. And we don't know what other crises might unfold that have nothing to do with the U.S. and China, but affect them. So I think it'll become harder for the Biden administration or whoever follows to isolate U.S.-China relations from these other crises and challenges. And that I'm only speculating here. I'm interested what my co-panelists have to say about this, but I think it's going to force Biden, and I should say, as both my friends here have said, China also faces challenges that are going to occupy a lot of attention in the year ahead, economic challenges, unemployment challenges that are going to consume a lot of attention and require President Xi to work harder to mend ties with Europe, to develop economic ties in the Middle East and Africa. So these developments, if you combine them, I think are going to put pressure on both sides to avoid turning U.S.-China into another crisis that's going to disrupt world affairs and might lead to some inclination on both sides to find ways to work together, even if it's sort of de facto working together to solve some of these other unforeseeable or emerging crisis, especially those arising out of the Israel-Hamas crisis, which is, so far as I could tell, is still spiraling out of control. So I'll stop with that observation.
Thank you, Michael. What we want to do at this point is to see if either of you want to ask or give pushback to what you heard from fellow sister panelists before we open the Q&A.
I'd certainly like to know what Yun-Sun and Zhikun-Ju think about what I just said.
I can go ahead. I think that's very insightful. I think you rightly pointed out that both US and China will have other focuses next year. I think China definitely would prioritize its domestic economic growth, which was the slowest last year since 1979. And US has a domestic election, and externally, US has a war in Ukraine and the Gaza crisis, so two primary challenges to tackle. So I think that gives us a very rational background to the summits that happened in San Francisco, because
Yes.
both leaders have, I wouldn't say bigger fish to fry, but have sizable fish to fry. And
Yeah,
at this moment, it appears that those issues are going to occupy the primary attention and resources for both governments and both leaders. So one point that I would like to raise is that things may not always happen according to what we want, right? We can only plan and strive for the end game that we would like to see, but we can never plan for all the unexpected, and in some cases the expected. So, like for example, I think most observers would expect. I'm just talking about speculation here. So next January, when Taiwan has its election, most people probably would speculate at this point that DPP candidate will win. And for the better informed observers, I think the consensus more or less is that, well, letting the winning the election does not necessarily mean that the immediate rupture of U.S. China relations or cross-strait relations by his winning. The next testing moment will be May 20th, which will be the inauguration of the next Taiwanese president. And if there's going to be a major policy platform on cross-strait relations, it more likely will be laid out by that inauguration speech, which means that between the election day and the May 20th, we most likely are going to have a little bit more than 4 months of a escalatory period, because during that period, China will want to use military show of force to deter what they anticipate to be the pro-independence position. Again, I'm totally hypothetical. I'm speculating here. The pro-independence statement from the DPP candidate or from the DPP winner of that election, and then by May 20th, that inauguration speech day is going to be even potentially more risky in terms of triggering the Chinese response and U.S. rightful reaction to that Chinese response. Then for the rest of the year, we will be looking at a cross-strait relationship that probably would be worse than what it has been in the past 8 years, right? So what it basically means is that, yeah, I think U.S. and China both would like to prioritize other issues, not necessarily prioritize each other as a primary challenge or the primary adversary for next year, but it may not happen according to what we want.
Zhikun, did you want to comment?
Very briefly, I think Michael, highlighted some of the problems in the relationship. The United States, for example, will continue to strengthen alliances with all these allies in the Asia-Pacific region, and of course, China also has its own version of forming not formal allies, but the so-called comprehensive strategic partnerships. China is forming with all these countries. So you see the two powers will continue to compete for dominance in the region and globally with their own partners and allies. So that's a big problem. Another challenge, I think, is that the two countries, are not really matching the deeds with the what they promised. I don't see the matching of words and deeds here. For example, I think it is easy really to implement the San Francisco vision. If you're really serious, just there are still some low-hanging fruits, to be picked. For example, the Biden administration so far still has not reinstated the Fulbright program in China, PRC, and Hong Kong. I think they should do it without further delay. And just yesterday, or the day before, Ambassador Nicholas Burns was talking about, the sharp gap between the two sides in terms of students studying each other country. China has about, close to 300,000 students studying in the United States. The United States, American students, how many American students are studying in China? Ranges from 300 to 700, but it's just in the hundreds, we wonder why, right? I think one of the reasons that, actually the State Department still has this level 3 travel advisory for China, which basically tells Americans that don't go, it's not safe to travel to China now. I think this China got to be one of the safest countries to travel, right? You got to lower that level 3 to level 2, so that level 2 means exercise increased caution, normal caution, right? I think we are at that stage now after the pandemic, right? There's also a problem on both sides. This is the so-called securitization of the policies. We all know that China has focused more on security than on the economy, right, in recent years, and it passed the national security law in Hong Kong, right? Also on mainland, China updated its anti-espionage law in July 2023 to raise public awareness of espionage risks associated with interacting with foreign individuals and businesses. And the government intends to build a so-called legal Great Wall. Of course, the United States continues to block export of advanced chips to China and set obstacles for Chinese investment in the United States and U.S. investment in China, also in the name of protecting America's national interest. The other day, this senator from Florida even said that the garlic from China poses a national security threat to the United States, which is very funny. I think on both sides, you see this trend of securitization of policies. National security has been abused or simply used as a decoy for objectionable policies. So we have a long way to go, really.
So we've got a number of questions which are building up, and I'm really glad to see them and want to encourage others to put your questions into the Q&A button box down there. I do want to kind of transition here with one question, though, for each of you. Given that we are wanting to monitor, doing what we can to avoid unexpected crises, the expectation here is that between now and the U.S. election, the floor will likely stay stable. In that circumstance, what do you think the priorities for American civil society should be in terms of preventing unexpected crises, the possibility of a confrontation, and for building something akin to common security relations between the two powers? So whoever would like to take that on first. See, you're racing to the racing to the opportunity.
Professor Klare probably would like to go.
I'll start and see if anybody wants to add. In my view, it's the daily, day-to-day military incidents that are occurring in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, and the airspace around Taiwan that worries me the most. This is all provocative maneuvers, where China sends up its planes to probe Taiwan's airspace, the U.S. sends ships into the Taiwan Strait and in the around the islands claimed by China in the South China Sea, or to demonstrate muscle, to act in a threatening and coercive manner, to demonstrate toughness. And these kind of incidents could get out of hand very quickly. There have been images shown of Chinese planes coming very close to American planes and endangering their stability. This is the sort of thing that could lead to an escalatory spiral at a moment's notice. And these could easily be cut back and steps taken to avert a mid-air collision or some other kind of disastrous encounter as a result of these kinds of maneuvers. And I think we should be pushing for reductions in provocative maneuvers on the U.S. side and for talks with China through these military links to persuade China to cut back on its own provocative maneuvers. That, in my mind, would greatly reduce the risk of unintended escalation and conflict.
Shi-kun or Yun, would you like to comment?
Sure, I would, especially on the issue of the military risk. I agree with most of the things that Professor Klare has said. I understand the concern for inadvertent conflict or inadvertent war. I understand the concern about the potential for one accident to spiral out of control. But here are two issues. The first one is when people talk about this inadvertent war with China, and I cannot help but ask the question: when was the last time that China got into a war by accident? I have a difficult time trying to figure out an example on that. This is not to say that it is impossible to have an inadvertent conflict with China, but this is to say that I think for China, the escalation control is very rigid and quite stringent. So I don't exclude the potential or the possibility of having an accident, but for that accident to escalate to a full-front confrontation, a conflict, and then a full war, I think that's a very long journey to travel. The second point that I would like to make is that, well, Professor, you basically touched the point. The essential difference or the essential problem is the difference between the Chinese preferred crisis prevention versus the U.S. preferred crisis management. From the Chinese perspective, crisis prevention means don't come to our neighborhood. We won't have a crisis. But for the U.S. perspective, the argument is what we have every right to be where we are. So if you want to conduct unsafe and unprofessional intercept or maneuvers against our warplanes and our warships, it is a matter of crisis management. So without solving that fundamental difference between two sides, I don't think that they're going to come a very fruitful conversation about, because China's position is don't come, we won't have a crisis. U.S. position is don't interfere when we come, then we won't have a crisis. So
well,
the two sides are not seeing eye to eye on that perspective.
Yeah. Well, let me respond to that, because you have incidents occurring in the South China Sea that involve third parties, like the Philippines, where the U.S. has a treaty, a mutual defense treaty. So we could question how legitimate that is. But when China blocked and reportedly endangered Coast Guard vessels belonging to the Philippines, the U.S. response was that we have a mutual defense treaty with the Philippines, and military action against the Philippines naval vessel impinges or affects our mutual defense treaty. And the official statement is, we will come to the rescue of the Philippines in future such incidents. So I fully agree with what you say, Yun-sun, about China saying, don't come into our territory, but you do have these kind of situations that are more complicated than that, where local powers view China as the aggressor in the area, that China is intruding into its territory.
What I'd like to do to save some time here for the Q&A is to ask if Zhikun would like to comment, and then I'd like to turn to the questions we've gotten and trust that our panelists can riff on those questions in part by what build what we're doing here. So Zhikun, up to you.
Yeah, very briefly, since we're talking about the South China Sea, again, I want to highlight the two very different perspectives from the United States and China. I think what the United States is doing over there, of course, it's to protect freedom of navigation, trade, and demonstrate its commitment to allies in the region. All these are good things, I think, from U.S. perspective. And of course, viewed from China's perspective, this is totally destabilizing, because you're basically emboldening the Philippines to initiate some conflict. Same thing about Taiwan. By selling weapons to Taiwan, you're trying to deter China from attacking Taiwan, but it's going to be counterproductive, because it will harden China's determination, to be fully prepared in case the United States will intervene militarily in the future. So a war is more likely, actually. So again, I think on both sides, looks like both arguments make some sense from their domestic perspective, but then you put them together, they are opposite. And so where's the truth? How can we reconcile the differences, right? I want to add one more thing here. I think, because you can see from my background, and I live in rural Pennsylvania, a small village. I think, if you, live in a small village, probably you appreciate, the differences. I think, people in DC, these politicians probably view this relationship very different from where I'm from. Where I'm from, I see more common interests among the two, between the two countries and between the two peoples. I think, American people are just like Chinese people, very friendly, value families, emphasize education, just want to have a good life. They really share so much in common. I don't know why these politicians in DC want to hyper, these threats from each other, both sides, right? Hyper the threat from each other and focus on the differences. Why can't we focus on the positive, on the common areas? And as they say, competition is good, but you want to engage in a kind of healthy competition, not a cutthroat, zero-sum competition. As they say, a rising tide raises all boats. I think both China and the United States will benefit from a healthy competition, but not from this current zero-sum competition. This is just terrible. I think people in DC and people in Beijing probably should come to the countryside, live for a while, and they will appreciate what they should do.
There's a tradition of sending politicians down to the countryside. So kind of building on what Zhikun just said in terms of commonality, I want to turn to a couple of questions from Ira Helfand, Physicians for Social Responsibility, and a lot more. He asks, of all the potential problems between the U.S. and China, none poses greater danger than the possibility of nuclear conflict. Are the Chinese and American leadership capable of understanding the urgent need to work for the elimination of these nuclear weapons? Is it possible that cooperation to address this overwhelming threat could be a model for cooperation in issues like climate crisis? So, question about the capacity of U.S. and Chinese leadership.
I can give it a shot. I think in terms of the the nuclear conflict and the prospect for arms control dialogue between the two countries, there are some movement. We know that in November, the State Department and Chinese Foreign Ministry had one round of arms control dialogue that, in fact, the U.S. has been calling for a few years. China still sticks to the no first use principle as a part of its nuclear doctrine. So what the Chinese are trying to develop and protect is their credible second strike capability. So the survivability of the Chinese nuclear arsenal to withstand the first round of attack so that China can launch the second strike against the aggressor. So that's the Chinese nuclear doctrine, but the U.S. does not have a no first use doctrine. So in terms of the arms control dialogue, the Chinese have also rejected to join, for example, the arms control dialogue between U.S. and Russia, citing the large discrepancy between their nuclear arsenals, that China only has a couple of hundreds nuclear warheads, while U.S. has thousands and Russia has thousands. So the playground is not level. So that's one major obstacle for the arms control dialogue to happen, or the disarmament dialogue to happen. But I do see some encouraging signs in terms of the what they call the cross-domain emerging emerging technology, cross-domain threats. So that's on AI, that's on cyber, that's on space. So how those new technologies impact, for example, the nuclear command and control. Should AI be allowed to run the decision-making on the nuclear command and control? That if AI is indeed seen as a credible decision maker. So I think the conversation between the two countries are more likely to bear fruit on those emerging technologies in terms of the arms control and nuclear conversation, because the rules are not yet made, right? So there are plenty of space issues that could inspire conversation and potentially inspire the agreements to be reached. Thank you.
Shikun or Michael, would you like to comment?
I think Young Sun said very eloquently, summed up the present situation regarding the arms control potential talks. I do think that the fact of the summit itself, as I started out, was a recognition that relations between the two sides were spiraling out of control, and that there was, at that point, no bottom to where they might spiral. And a nuclear war will not occur out of the blue between the U.S. and China. It will be the product of an accumulation of stresses and crises over time. So the processes set up in San Francisco, if they bear fruit, if they move forward to alleviate some of these stresses in the relationship and allow for talks on other issues, could reduce the possibility that you'll have this chain reaction of developments, what I call inadvertent escalation, that would trigger a nuclear war. So it's just as important to focus on the political side of the problem as it is on the technical arms control part.
So I'm going to jump in here with a question actually from Australia. Ross Wither, if I'm pronouncing the name right. I ask a question from the perspective of the Independent and Peaceful Australia Network. What impact do you think the talks, which I assume was the summit, will have on Pacific NATO initiative, namely the AUKUS pact between the U.S., UK, and Australia, which appears to be directly aimed at surrounding and threatening China?
Hi, Ross. I met Ross in Brisbane. Thank you, Ross, for attending the seminar and raising a great question. I think, obviously, China is strongly opposed to the expansion of NATO to Asia. Well, I mean, China already opposed NATO expansion in Europe itself. So Asian version of NATO involving other U.S. allies, in the name of collective security, but the real purpose, of course, is to counter China. I think it's going to be disastrous, for everybody involved. I hope it's not going to happen. I'm pretty sure, countries in the Asia-Pacific region, such as Australia, will exercise their strategic autonomy. I think, speaking of the third countries, I strongly believe that U.S.-China competition is detrimental to international community. I think third parties have a role to play here, which is to push the two powers to work together instead of forming all these small circles to contain each other. So I think the countries in the Asia-Pacific regions can, perhaps tell both the United States and China that, these security or military groups will not work. They are counterproductive, and if the United States insists to expand NATO to Asia, I think Australia and other U.S. allies should boldly say no instead of, like the case of AUKUS. I think AUKUS itself is still very controversial in Australia. I think people in Australia should not let this another, small group politics, small group security community, happen again in the name of, expanding, stability or prosperity to the Asia Pacific, because the opposite is going to be the outcome.
Michael?
Yes, unless Yun-Sun wants to say something, I will defer to her.
You're too kind, Professor. I'll let you go first, and then I'll add something.
So I'll just add one footnote to this, and that comes back to the prior question by Ira Helfand, and that is, there's an element to the AUKUS, the Australia, US, UK agreement that isn't so widely discussed, but this is essentially formed around nuclear submarines and nuclear technology. And I think it has many secret elements to it that we in the public are not aware of, but bear on the issue of nuclear war and nuclear war escalation that Ira Helfand was so concerned about. And that's what the peoples of the Asia Pacific should be demanding answers about. What are the secret protocols involved in this agreement? What are the nuclear dimensions that could have escalatory implications? What are these submarines intended for? What are their technological capabilities? What weapons will they carry? And what other intelligence factors? Australia already plays a role in U.S. nuclear warning and command systems. So far as I know, there's a lot of secrecy involved in this, but this is what the countries in Asia Pacific should want to know more about, and should be demanding answers from their government and the Australian government and the U.S. government.
Thank you. Yun, did you want to comment?
Yes, I do. I think first off, to my knowledge, AUKUS is moving forward. It's not going to transpire. It's not going to produce a submarine, the nuclear powered submarine, nuclear propelled submarine for Australia anytime soon, because it takes time to build them. But to my knowledge, the deal is indeed moving forward. And also, if you look at the Chinese wording, and if you look at the non-proliferation treaty very carefully, what the Chinese have said is AUKUS is in violation of the spirit of NPT. What it actually means is that AUKUS does not violate the stipulation of NPT, because it actually made use of a loophole in terms of the nuclear propelled or the nuclear propulsion for the naval vessels instead of the nuclear armed naval vessels. So I think it's very clear that, well, people don't like AUKUS, but AUKUS does not violate NPT, at least not its wording and its stipulation. And last, in terms of the future of the Pacific NATO, first of all, the Pacific NATO, what the U.S. and countries in the Pacific are prioritizing is not actually a region-wide anti-China coalition like a NATO. In fact, what they're prioritizing is minilaterals. So what we're seeing AUKUS, 3 countries, in terms of the, for example, the August 15 Camp David statement, that's among U.S., Japan, and South Korea, that's also minilateral. So I don't think it is accurate to describe the strategy as a region-wide counter-China coalition. But instead, what we're seeing is the emergence of many minilaterals among countries who share concerns about a certain aspect of China's position or China's behavior. So that comes to the future of AUKUS and the future of these anti-China coalitions. I think in terms of Australia, I think the person who raised the question knows the domestic politics of Australia much better than we do. And I think we do see a major difference between the previous Morrison government's China policy and the current Labour Party government's policy towards China. So that's a domestic choice. That's a domestic, I would say, not a domestic issue, but it depends on who is in charge, who is in power in Australia. It also depends on who will win the election here in the United States next year, right? If Trump wins and it's America first again, and it will shake the credibility and shake the confidence of U.S. allies and partners about U.S. leadership and commitment, and that's going to have an impact. And last but not least, I would say it also depends on what China will do. China currently is launching the charm offensive, but we all know that it's because China's economy is not doing so well. Well, but what if China's economy picks up speed again and China quickly emerges as a well, most people think it won't happen, but China becomes a more confident or more assertive again. So it depends on all these factors. I wouldn't say it's just a one-dimensional argument. Thank you.
So I'm looking at the time here. I'm aware that there's a baby that's going to need to be cared for, that we have to wrap up promptly at 8:15. We have at least one more question, and then some announcements, maybe squeeze in two questions. We'll see. So from Tina Liakopoulos, where does China stand in the Israel-Palestine issue, more than an issue? How can they influence the outcome and prevent U.S. from making things worse? And would China impose sanctions on Israel for its tremendous crimes against humanity? Shikun or Yun-sun, would you want to jump in on this?
I can give it a try. So China's position on Israel-Palestine is well, China's position currently, one, is a two-state solution, which China has been supporting for decades. Two, it's very clear that China, in terms of the conflict itself, China is more on the side of the of Palestine and Arab countries. The Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi hosted I believe the delegation from the Arab and Islamic countries in Beijing about 2 weeks ago, and China said very clearly on this issue, China sides with Arab and Israel and Islamic countries. And China calls for ceasefire, but it's very difficult for ceasefire to transpire currently in the current situation. So I think on that, the Chinese are sticking to their principled positions. But I haven't seen, well, China has conducted shuttle diplomacy, sending a special envoy to the region to try to bring countries together to discuss. But I haven't seen a lot of concrete and tangible success in that regard. So some journalists keep asking that, well, China was able to facilitate the normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran in March this year. So can China do this? And my answer is no, China cannot do this because you cannot pull a rabbit out of the thin air. China is not a magician. The Saudi-Iran deal actually happened because those two countries actually wanted to stabilize their relationship. And that precondition simply does not exist in the current Israel-Palestine conflict or crisis. Sanctions on Israel, very unlikely unless there is a UN Security Council resolution, which again is also, I wouldn't even say unlikely, it's impossible. I don't see China imposing unilateral sanctions on Israel, but I think China has already made its position very clear that China is not supporting Israel on this particular issue. Thank you.
So just before either of you go further on this, I mean, it's interesting. It seems to me that certainly Israel, but also the United States, is losing influence or increasingly marginalized throughout the Middle East, including Iran, and certainly the Gulf states. And it would seem that in many ways, China and Russia are likely to emerge with greater influence in the region, and the U.S. rather less, with great implications for power and privilege in the world. Xi-kun or Michael, do you want to comment?
Just very briefly, I think the China's position regarding this current crisis, I mean, China's policy towards the Middle East has been consistent, basically hoping that the two sides, this two-state solution is still is the preferred policy of China. Some people say that China is kind of pro-Arab states, which is not necessarily true, because if you look at China's relationship with Israel, you realize that actually China and Israel have a very close and special relationship. Actually, I learned that, if without the Hamas attack, Netanyahu was planning to visit China late October, just to show that how close Israel was to China. But of course, I think in the current situation, I guess the Chinese government thinks that maybe the Netanyahu government has gone too far. I think Israel has every right for self-defense, but then not indiscriminately. With the casualty of civilians every day. Even President Biden, has spoken out against Israelis' policies. So it really puts China in a dilemma, because China has always projected itself as a neutral power and that has good relations with all countries in the region. But in this case, I think China is kind of taking a stand, against Israel's current policies. But I don't think, I agree with you, and I don't think China will actually take any specific measures to sanction Israel. I think, it's going to be up to the United Nations. And right there, actually, the United States and China perhaps can work together, because the United States, up to this point, still hopes that, the two-state solution can be implemented. But of course, Netanyahu has rejected it. So that's the problem. I don't know how this tragedy will end, but I don't think there'll be no winner in this tragedy. By the way, I think outsiders tend to exaggerate China's influence in the Middle East. The fact is, China's influence is much smaller than the United States. Mm-hmm. A lot of people look up to China for leadership, but I don't think China can do much about it. So this is going to be a terrible situation for everybody involved, including China itself, because its image has already been tarnished to a great extent for not doing much more than people have hoped for.
Michael, a last word? Nope. Okay. Well, I want to thank the three of you for moving the conversation forward, helping to educate and build, I think, people who are people of conscience and people who are concerned about these issues across the country. And as we heard from our Australian question internationally, I want to also thank Mariana Fernandez, who is sort of invisible on the screen here, but who technologically has made all of this possible. And I want to call participants' attention. One, that we'll be sending out a link to the recording. So if you want to study this, build on it, you can. And also to say that there's a whole lot more information on the website of the Committee for Sane U.S. China Policy. The website address is saneuschinapolicy.org. So with that, I want to thank each of you again, and may we continue to work for and actually live in peace with justice, and just say let's whatever we can do to stop the killing in Gaza. Take care. We still have a few people on, so any conversation we have is listened to by 44 people.
But thank you, Mariana, once again for organizing this and making it possible.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
I will be uploaded into YouTube and I'll share the link.
Okay, great. Yeah, I've been watching as well the transcript here, So maybe we can capture that and send it my way as well.
Yeah, I will try to do that as well.
Okay. So Michael, when does your family take off for California?
Well, let's not.
I won't go there. Okay. All right. Yes. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. We're going to say goodbye to the people who are slowly getting off this and wish everybody health and a good holiday period. Be well.
Be well.
Bye.
Bye-bye.